We are now live in Yukon, Oklahoma, and we are starting a new series on Christ in the Old Testament. Now, this was voted on. So if you don't remember that, I asked you, what would you like to do next? And it was this. There was also Ruth had a high vote. Esther had high vote. And I said, well, we could also teach on the book of Hebrews and be at it for 5 years. And so that was voted on. There were several that wanted that. I said, you guys are insane. But this one here had the most votes. And so basically, we're going to be teaching you something called typology, the shadows in the Old Testament, and how they are foreshadowing Jesus Christ. And a lot of people say, well, is Jesus in the Old Testament? What's that all about? So we're going to be answering those questions as we go along. Now, the first day, this is day one. Thank you, Denise. The first day, it could be a little dry. So I'm trying to make it more interesting because I have to put in the technical stuff about what is typology, and I have a tendency to want to get academic and really understand it. And that's not what this class is for, since you're not all going for a degree in seminary, although you should think about it. Anyways, so with that, yeah, we need to recognize that the New Testament is the old concealed, and the Old Testament is the new revealed. This is from Augustine, famous theologian. And basically, we need both of them. We need the Old Testament and New Testament. So when you eliminate one and you think that all you need is only New Testament as a church, there's a lot of things that you will be lacking. So I wanted to make sure that you recognize that some of the things about Jesus that were hidden in the Old Testament are revealed in the New Testament. And there are some things in the New Testament that were brand new. They were mysteries. They were not in the Old Testament, such as you guys, the church. Okay, so we need to understand that. Well, we're going to be doing 13 people that were foreshadowed about Christ. I'm going to be talking, starting next week, we'll be talking on Adam first, then Noah, then Abraham, Melchizedek, Joseph, Moses and Joshua, Samuel, David, Elijah, and Elisha, or Elisha, depends how you want to say that, and Zerubbabel, and then another Joshua. There are two of them. Yeah, how's that? And the second one is Joshua the high priest. So we're going to learn about him also. Well, so I'll be going into great detail on each of these and how Jesus was foreshadowed by these types. And we'll get a chance to go slow or fast. Depends on the level of the class. And some of these people you may know nothing about, like Melchizedek. Okay? Some people are like, okay, who's he? Yeah, he's a strange guy. And it's going to be fun when we get to him because there's only 2 Bible verses. And I can teach for probably 2 or 3 hours on Melchizedek. All right? And so, anyways, just to let you know where we're headed. And so, but today we're going to be introducing you to this idea, this concept called types and shadows. Okay? Some people have asked me ahead of time what my sources are for doing this kind of teaching. So one is this cool book here on typology. We'll pass it around if you're interested in getting it. Take a picture of it and go order yourself one. But it's more like what you'd get if you took a seminary class. That's why I like it so much. It's got a lot of cool footnotes and things like that. But we'll pass it around so you can see what it's about. There's a free book out on Amazon called From the Shadows to the Savior, Christ in the Old Testament by Douglas Van Dorn. I like him. And I might be able to get a copy of that and get it out to all of us, but I'm not sure yet. And then also Rose Publishing, the slides I'm using, I buy them from Rose Publications, and then I start to add my own into it. Okay, so they provide 100 slides ahead of time but we're going to go through about 300. Okay, so that 100, I felt like it was just very superficial and basic. And this is a room of people who want to know more. Inquiring minds want to know more. Okay, so I'm adding to it, and you'll see that in today's presentation they had 5 slides for the introduction. Oh gosh, we'll be done with that in minutes. So that's not enough. So you can count them on your own how many we have today. All right. So the first part though is Christ in the Old Testament. Jesus Christ, he's the key to what God is pointing to. All through the people of Israel and their history, everything about them is pointing to Jesus. Do you guys realize that after Jesus rose from the dead, he's walking down this road. He comes across these 2 guys who are walking to a small town called Emmaus. And as he's walking along, he comes up next to them. They don't know it's Jesus. Now, I always thought that was interesting. They can't see who he is. Somehow he's got himself disguised, I guess. But he starts talking to them, and they're very sad because Jesus was crucified, and so they're crying about it. And he's walking along with them. He says, "Well, what's the problem?" They said, "Well, haven't you heard the news? You know, the rabbi, he's dead." And he looks at them and says, "Well, don't you know that was foretold? All of the scriptures foretold that." And they're like, "What?" So he says, from Moses all the way to all the prophets, he taught them everything about Jesus, about himself, from all that as they're walking along the road. Then they finally get to Emmaus and they sit down. They get invited into the house. They're going to give him some food. He eats with them, and then he's gone. But the fascinating part for me, I mean, I like the cool thing that he disappeared also, but how did he teach them about himself only using from Moses forward? All the Old Testament. It's all about Jesus. So we're only going to study 13 of them. But there's also events, there's institutions and other things that if you want to study more, there's a lot more to it. So Christ in the Old Testament. Well, one way of picturing Christ in the Old Testament is to look at things that are in parallel. The Old Testament, people, events, and things, and the New Testament. So we're going to be doing some of that as we talk about these things called types, these shadows. So in particular, if I was to have a bright light right here on me, there would be a shadow behind me. When light shines on an object, that object will cast a shadow. And when it does that, it actually gives you certain characteristics about the object that the light's on, but you only see the shadow. You don't see the object if all you're looking at is the shadow. So there's certain things you'll be able to tell about me, how tall I am, if it was perfect or angle. If I'm doing things with my body, you see shadows, characteristics of me, but also specific real objects will be missing from that shadow. It's obvious to all of us. Well, but there's enough similarities about the shadow that you'd be able to tell, oh, that's Curtis's shadow. Or, if I had Aowen or a white dog, you would see her shadow and say, oh, yeah, that's Aowen. That's obvious. She has a distinct body type and everything. So there's certain things that you can find from shadows. Well, the Old Testament, we're going to be calling them shadows. We're going to see why. All right. Well, it's interesting also that Plato, in the book called The Republic, he tells a story. It's a story about these people who, at childhood, were chained, imprisoned inside of a cave. And they're facing a wall, and they're chained, and they're in manacles in such a way that they can't even see each other on the sides. They can only see straight forward in this story. And they're looking straight forward, and on the wall, they see shadows. Well, behind them, they don't know this, there's a roadway across the top part here, and there's people behind that, and they're walking along doing different shadow puppet type of puppeteering, all right? Well, these children grow up their entire lives in that cave, only seeing the shadows. They don't know that there's something real behind them, and they can only look forward. Well, as this is happening, the walls of the cave is their only reality. That's what you're getting out of the story. And then one of the prisoners is released. And that prisoner, he's unshackled, he's brought out, and when he first walks forward behind where the bright light is at, it blinds him, it hurts him. So he's thinking he's being taken to something bad and evil. He's taken to reality, but he don't know that yet. So he's pulled out, and then as he walks out into the bright light, he can't see. He's blinded. And he's thinking it would be better to be back in the shadow, back in the cave. And they're saying, no, we want you to see and keep coming out. As his eyes begin to adjust, he begins to see people. And some of the stuff that he saw shadows of, he now sees what they are, the real objects. And so he wants to go back and tell the others that the wall shadows are not real. The reality is out here. So he goes back to tell them about reality. They think he's crazy. As a matter of fact, when he first comes back, he can hardly see now because he's in the darkness. And so he's blinded. And so he's telling them, no, when you go out there, you can see real things, the real stuff. And they're like, no, when you go out there, you're going to blind yourself. See, you're blinded. So the whole thing is they don't believe him, even though the shadows is from something that's real. Okay, so on the walls of the cave, only the shadows are the truth, is what you're learning from Plato. Well, there's a little bit more than that. Erasmus, let's see if I can get this to work here. There we go. This is the greatest theologian during the Renaissance, is this man here. And this is what he said also. What difference is there, do you think, between those in Plato's cave who can only marvel at the shadows and the images of various objects, provided they are content and don't know what they miss, and the philosopher who emerged from the cave and sees the real things? What difference is there between those two? Well, that's what we're going to see also here. As we start to study and see the shadows, we're going to find out that the reality of what they're talking about, they're foreshadowing the real object, which is Jesus. So I want you to kind of get a sense and feel for that. All right. So then what is topology? This is, in the early church, the very first way that Christians learned how to understand theology and the Bible was they looked at the Old Testament and they saw these types, these shadows about Jesus. And that was the first way that they learned. And it's like opening a window of all the God's activities. When you look at the Old Testament and you start to see some of the types and shadows, you'll begin to realize there's a lot more here. And a part of that is we can see God setting up history in such a way that's progressing toward Jesus, steps along the way. It's a progression of revelation, which is it shows how all the affairs of mankind are all leading up to this one reality. And the types will reveal God's progressive revelation. So as you go through this class, and as we talk about these 13, you'll see a progression, because also we're going to do them in a chronological order. So you can see that progression, how things are being added up. And which is fascinating to me, because when you talk about what's real and what's not real, when Jesus rose from the dead, he had a glorified body. And that body could do things that our bodies can't do. He'll be sitting down with a bunch of people eating, and then he walks through a wall and disappears. How's that possible? So I'm reading a book right now by a physicist who's a quantum physicist, and it's on the quantum physics of the resurrection. And yeah, I know. It's got a lot of math in it. I understand a little bit of it, but this is the part that's fascinating to me. He shows that Jesus, when he had his glorified body, was real. He was a fully real. And the walls are like the shadows. He just walks right through them. Because he's real and they are only partial. So I started thinking about that. Moses, when he came down off of Mount Sinai, he had a plan for how to do the tabernacle. And that plan, he said, it was a type of the real tabernacle he saw in heaven. And he built it based off of what he saw for real, even though this was more like the shadow. So this concept is one that's throughout the Bible, but we oftentimes ignore it. We move on because we don't know either the original language or it just says it was a type of something, and you're like, okay, type, move on. Well, I want you to see this morning, what is a type? What's it talking about? So what is it? The Bible's full of these. They're parallels. We call them types. And the study of types is called typology. Ology means the study of something, and types. And the biblical types has two types of objects. There is a type and an antitype. So the type is the shadow that's foretelling you about the antitype. So example, Moses is a foreshadow of Jesus. We're going to see why. And maybe this one might help you. Inside of the tabernacle, there are furniture. And the furniture, one example is there's a table called the table of showbread. Okay, this is a table that's 3 feet by 2 feet by 2.5 feet off the ground. It's made out of acacia wood, which is the hardest wood in the desert, acacia wood, and then it's coated around with gold. Gold, what do they call that? Okay, gold plating. All right. So the whole thing is in gold, but inside of it is the acacia hard wood. This is a type of Jesus being fully man and fully God. That's one example. And on the showbread, the table, there are 12 breads, baked bread, 6 each pile. So there's 2 piles. And these 12 bread, they're made out of 6 pounds of flour and not really flour though, because they're actually they have no yeast in them. So I guess it would be flour, but without yeast. Yeah. And so they are foreshadowing the Messiah will be the bread of life, and he will come and Jesus actually said, "I am the bread of life." And at one point, right after he said that, I don't know if you know this or not, but shortly after that, he's with a bunch of people who are hungry, and he blesses these 2 loaves of bread, and they fed 5,000 people, plus there was 12 bushels full afterwards of bread. And he says, "I am the bread of life, and he who believes in me," he is basically the one who's providing for us. So those are called types and shadows. And so that showbread was a type or foreshadowing Jesus being the bread of life. That's just an example of that. Now, the word type comes from a Greek word. Some of you like to look things up when I'm talking, so I give you the Strong's Greek number for it, tupos. And tupos originally means a mark. If I took a hammer and hit metal, it would leave a mark there. Well, over time, they realized they could take a die and hit it and leave markings. So that became the type. We have the same thing. When type first started, the Gutenberg, they set up all the types, and then when they pressed it down, it left a mark. Now it left a mark on paper, right? So we still call it type. And so the first time that tupos is used is talking about something that is a mark from a blow. But over time in the Bible, it becomes a figure or a copy of something. It could be a pattern that's being talked about in the scriptures. Tupos can also mean something that is being foreshadowed or prefigured into the future. And so this study is, how do we know something's really a type versus it's just someone making up a bunch of stupid stuff? All right. I don't know if you guys were here. We have a guy on Wednesday nights who's been coming back and teaching. He's a professor, seminary professor. I love the guy. He's so funny also. But he says, let me show you why we need to learn how to do this properly. He took the story of the 153 fish that were found. Okay, Jesus says, cast your net over there, pull it up. There's 153 fish. Do you know how many people try to make something important out of that? All right. There's a lot of people out there who will try to say that has some sort of spiritual connotation to it. And I like this man because he says, no, it just means there's a lot of fish. Okay. Well, so same thing happens with these types. As we study the Old Testament, sometimes we'll come across something, and some people will try to make a lot more out of this than what it is. So we got to have some rules about this. So that's why I'm going to teach you, how do we go about figuring out what is a real type versus you just made up a bunch of garbage, okay? So a biblical type, first of all, there are 3 well-defined qualities that we have to consider. The first one is it must be a true picture of that which is being represented. It must be true. And it can't be I wouldn't have a picture of something that has some good stuff in there and then some marred stuff. No, that would not be a type. That would just be a marred image. Okay. Instead, it's got to be true and representing what was prefiguring. The second thing is the type must be by divine appointment. It will be obvious that this has the fingerprints of God in it. And so as we go along, we're going to start figuring out what makes something definitely from God versus man just made it up. Okay, we want to know the difference there. We want to have discernment, and a part of that is this recognizing the fingerprints of God. Third thing is a type will always prefigure something that's in the future. It's never going to be something in the past. Okay, we're going to go to the Old Testament. If we say there's a type here, it's prefiguring something future. It's not, going backwards in time. So this will help us when I give you some trick ones later. Yes?
Why is it not going backwards?
Because our definition for a typology is something that's moving forward. It's a part of our definition. And if you'd like to have a seminary definition, I could give it to you at home. That's my son asking that question. Yes. All right. So, and another thing is that there's a link that ties the type and the antitype in correspondence. There similarities. There's some sort of connection between the two. And this is from the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. And it's basically saying the